Hey guys, I'm back. Of course, it's Celeste from Hex and Arcane, and I'm here to talk about another case that I first learned about from Unsolved Mysteries that really stuck with me. It's the case of nurse Cindy James, who either was stalked for years and tortured finally to death, or she fabricated the entire thing and staged an elaborate suicide. I did a ton of research on this, and the main thing I learned is that the internet is completely divided on this case. Some people are firmly convinced that she faked the entire thing, and others think that there is no way she could have done all those things to herself, and others think it's a combination of both of those. So let's get into some of the facts about this case. Cindy was born on June 12, 1944, in Vancouver, British Columbia, to parents Otto and Tilly Hack. Cindy was the oldest of 6 children and moved around constantly as a child since her father, Otto, was a Canadian Air Force colonel. I wasn't able to learn that much about her childhood except that she moved a lot and that she was regarded as a sincere, warm person with a great sense of humor. Later, Cindy revealed that she never felt good enough for her father and was never able to please him, and she also had some kind of off-putting moments, like having to eat dinner in the dark at the bottom of the basement stairs, which she said absolutely terrified her. I guess with so many children, there wasn't room at the table. I'm not really sure why she had to eat in the dark in the basement. That kind of stuff is a little strange, but there wasn't all that much about her upbringing, so I don't have context to put to that. Originally, Cindy wanted to go to college, but her father was really old-fashioned and didn't think that girls should go to college, and he approved of her being a nurse, so she ultimately decided to go to nursing school, where she graduated in 1966. She got married at 19 to a man who was 18 years her senior, psychiatrist Dr. Roy Makepeace, who was born in South Africa. Roy is an interesting figure in this case, and we will definitely come back to him. After she graduated, Cindy got a job at a preschool for children with behavioral and emotional issues. At work, she was well-liked, popular, and was known for bringing her beloved dog Heidi everywhere. She was also known for always wearing velour suits all the time when she worked at the school. Cindy was described as charismatic and really enjoyed the work she did at the school. She was there for 3 years before she became the director of the place. That seems like a really big accomplishment, and obviously she must have been good at what she did. Then, in 1982, after 16 years of marriage, Cindy separated from her husband Roy. And 4 months after this separation, the terrifying ordeal began that would ultimately end in her death. There are just as many indications that this was a murder as there are that this was some form of suicide or an accidental death, and a lot of the evidence is anecdotal and depend on who you want to believe. If she did this to herself, she was able to inflict horrific wounds that equal torture on herself, which I find really hard to wrap my head around. In a lot of cases I get really into, there's just nowhere near enough information out there. This case is exactly the opposite. There is so much that I just can't put it all in here. But if you're interested, there is more out there. There was at least one book written on the subject, and I guess her sister also wrote a book, but I wasn't able to get a copy of either. In fact, I've never seen evidence that her sister's book was actually published, but she does have an excerpt of it on her website. There's also a very in-depth 12-part series about the case on Audible that I found fascinating to listen to, so definitely go and check that out if you really want to get into this case more. I also really liked that it was fairly objective and didn't seem to make a definitive conclusion one way or another, which I read the book seemed to do. Alright, now that we know a little bit about Cindy, let's go into some of the facts surrounding the case before we examine the evidence that could point to one conclusion over another. $1.5 million was estimated to be spent on investigating this case with no substantial evidence found as a result. Over the course of almost 7 years, Cindy reported at least 100 incidents of harassment, assault, and property damage. Some of the phone calls were just breathing, others were whispered threats. Her phone lines were cut, windows repeatedly broken. Her prized garden was trashed. Dead cats and threatening notes were left in her yard. In one incident, her beloved dog was found shaking with fear with something tied tightly around her neck. She also appeared to have been beaten. Cindy's pillow was slashed at one point. She received other threatening notes with cutouts from magazines or books. There were several instances where she was physically assaulted, injected with some kind of drug, and found with a black nylon stocking tied tightly around her neck. Over the period of time in which Cindy was experiencing these instances of assault, harassment, and stalking, she moved several times, changed her phone number and last name to James, and even painted her car. However, the incidents continued. One of the police officers who was working on the investigation, Pat McBride, offered to move in temporarily with Cindy to help her with surveillance and ended up dating her. He actually seemed kind of obsessed with her and spent all of his time with her on and off duty. But Cindy ended up writing in her diaries that she was feeling that he wasn't helping her and that he seemed more interested in her than in finding her stalker. This put her off and she broke up with him. He did not experience any incidents during the time that he lived with Cindy directly. So while he was actually there, nothing happened. On May 25th, 1989, Cindy was on a break from work and was running some errands when she disappeared. Her car was found abandoned in a Safeway parking lot, and there was blood on the driver's side door, and the contents of her purse were strewn around inside and under the car. It would be 2 weeks before Cindy's body was found in the front yard of an abandoned house 1.5 miles away from her car. She had the signature black nylon around her neck that was used in several other assaults on her. She was hogtied and died of a drug overdose. It is believed that she died the same day that she went missing, but some signs point to her body only recently having been placed in that location. I can't go through all the incidents, but I will present some of the evidence that points to Cindy fabricating it or harming herself, and the evidence that suggests that there was another person who systematically tortured her to death. So let's start with the evidence for suicide. It is clear that Cindy did suffer from mental health issues, but she said that this was the result of prolonged fear and terror, along with not being believed. In fact, she said that the worst part was being accused of faking this. She was at different times diagnosed with anxiety, depression, paranoid disorder, suicidal ideation, PTSD, and a personality disorder. She was suicidal at times, attempted to commit suicide, and wrote in her journal that she wanted to die. She felt hopeless and helpless and didn't think that this would end until she was dead. She was also hospitalized for a time and refused to speak to anyone or eat. Every time there was a surveillance on her house, there were no incidents. Sometimes it appeared that windows that were broken from the inside, not the outside. In one incident where Cindy had been impaled through the hand, the door was still locked from the inside. We'll discuss this incident more in a little bit. There was a time when her house was set on fire in the basement. Police said that the only access to the basement was through a window that would have been impossible to go through without disturbing the dust around it. Cindy claimed that a piece of paper that was on fire was thrown through the window, but the tall weeds outside the window were undisturbed. Cindy's friend and husband were sleeping upstairs. Cindy was not home at the time when the fire started, as she had taken her dog for a walk. Police and others found it strange that Cindy would go walking around outside at night by herself, when she reported how frequently and intensely she was being terrorized. To police, this contributed to the idea that she was staging these incidents. Police were convinced that Cindy was being evasive when questioned. They became suspicious of her demeanor and that she always seemed to be holding back information. She later did admit that she had recognized one of her assailants, but had not revealed who it was because he had threatened her mother and sister. She also later said that she suspected that her ex-husband Roy was behind the harassment and attacks. Publicly, she claimed that he would not have destroyed her garden, but she privately noted that this tipped her off, that it could have been him, since he had done that at some point in their marriage as well. For much of the time, she did seem evasive and to know more than she would say, but Cindy later said that although she did feel like she knew who was committing these acts, she was afraid to reveal it to the police. I'm not sure how that is different from reporting all these events to the police and hoping they would catch the person. I feel like if she knew more, she should have said what she knew if she really was trying to get help from the police. Like, if you want this to actually stop, instead of just calling the police every time something happens, call the police and tell them who it was that did it, and they can catch the person. So that part doesn't make any sense to me on her part, because she really would call the police. Like, she would call the police over 100 times to report incidents. If you know more and you're not telling the police, how are they going to find them? One officer claimed that she had rapid shifts in demeanor regarding certain lines of questioning and indicated the wrong arm for where she'd been injected with drugs as evidence that she was making it up. But to me, that really isn't totally indicative, because she was questioned sometimes very shortly after violent attacks where she was dealing with the effects of being injected with drugs, choked, or hit, and other things that would cause her to be disoriented and confused on exactly what happened and where. The police that think she faked it said that some of the attacks could have also been failed suicide attempts that she then later covered up. A female officer stated that she seemed to be seeking the attention and protection of the male officers, and because of this, she felt that Cindy was disingenuous and was making all of this up for attention and protection and to manipulate others. I felt like this officer's testimony regarding Cindy was extremely cold and even callous at times. Another point that could suggest that this was suicide is that Cindy was known for hoarding any prescriptions she was given, so she could have had the drugs that were found in her system when she died. When Cindy was hospitalized at one point, she began to question if she was in fact responsible for the attacks on herself, like she was being told that she was. She wondered if she may have unconsciously been committing these violent and terrifying attacks on herself without knowing that she was doing it. One of the therapists there thought she had multiple personality disorder, which is now called dissociative identity disorder, and possible schizophrenia, in addition to uncovering childhood trauma and feeling that she was not good enough for her father. So she always wanted to prove something to someone or get attention from father figures. After leaving the hospital, Cindy seemed to improve for a time. She was being medicated and was under the care of a therapist. She seemed more hopeful and less depressed. There was an approximately 3-year hiatus from where she did not receive threatening notes, calls, or incidents of assault or vandalism. So this seems really telling to me. If there was 3 years right after she was being treated for a mental illness, if she was doing it herself, maybe that had, I won't say cured her, but helped her to the point where she had stopped and then something kicked it off again. But if it was someone else doing it, why would they have stopped for 3 years? When Cindy's ex-husband, Roy, turned over a recorded message that he had on his answering machine that said, "Cindy, dead meet soon," the police analyzed it and determined that although distorted, it was a woman's voice and was most likely Cindy's voice. However, this may have been decided as a result of their pre-existing bias in the case, because they had already firmly decided that Cindy was faking the attacks, since it would be difficult to determine the exact origin of the distorted voice, even if they could definitively say that it was a woman's voice. However, it may have been the voice of a woman, but not Cindy. So we don't know. And if you want to go find it, you can find a recording of this. It's a very distorted voice. It's really creepy. Apparently, Roy had said that at first he thought that they were saying Sunday, dead meet soon, and he didn't realize at first that it was related to Cindy. And then later when he turned it in, they said, no, it says Cindy, dead meet soon, which I don't know why they would say to Roy, since he was at that time, I believe, divorced from her. It's all a little confusing. There's so much to this case that makes absolutely no sense to me at all. Like, none. Another sign that she could have been faking this is that after her death, there was an inquiry in which the police officer that lived with her gave testimony. According to him, he and his partner had used Cindy's telephone, then left the house for a while. When they came back, the phone line had been cut. The officer, Pat, stated that he checked his tools, which he had just thoroughly cleaned, and found some wire cutters appear to have just been used and had residue on them, which they shouldn't have had since they had just been cleaned. He was convinced that in at least this incident, Cindy had cut her own phone line. When Cindy's body was found, she had been choked with a nylon stocking and hogtied. This seems difficult, but someone was able to demonstrate that it would be possible to do to herself. One account also stated that the knot used to tie the hog tie knots were the same as a particular way in which Cindy tied her shoelaces. I don't know. They didn't explain how she tied her shoelaces, but said that she had a particular way of tying them and that the knot was the same. But I only saw this in one source, so I'm really not sure on this one. It's just one possible thing that could add to what we know. So that was some of the evidence that suggests that Cindy could have been responsible for her own death. Here's some of the aspects of the case that suggest that she may have been telling the truth and that she was a victim of stalking and homicide. Cindy claimed that she believed her ex-husband Roy was behind the attacks and that there is a theory going around the internet that he was running a prescription drug ring. This would give him access to the drugs that were found to be the cause of her death. This theory states that Roy had some of his patients carry out the attacks for him. It was also mentioned that twice during their marriage, Cindy had found the drugs and flushed them, which greatly angered Roy. Cindy had also told another friend that on a trip to another country, she had witnessed her husband at the time standing over two bodies, that of a man and a woman that he had just killed, and he threatened her not to tell anyone. So she'd been on a boat. She fell asleep. When she woke up, it was at an island, which she wasn't sure what island, I don't think, somewhere. And she came across a cabin or something, and there he was with these two bodies. And she was able to describe what the inside of the cabin looked like, but they weren't able to track it down because she really didn't know where exactly it was, and she didn't know what the outside really looked like. Another thing is that during the almost 7 years that Cindy was being stalked or tortured, Cindy's ex-husband Roy randomly showed up a few times at her house unannounced, and it seems kind of creepy to me. Like, he came in the middle of the night to tell her that he had received threatening phone calls and wanted to tell her in person. He also invited her to move back in with him and reportedly got upset when she refused. There were also some allegations that he was physically abusive to Cindy during their marriage, and he admitted that he hit her a few times during their marriage, but denied that there was any ongoing abuse, which I don't really see the difference. Like, hitting someone is abuse, and a couple times means it's ongoing, but whatever. He claimed that the incidents were probably related to the mob, not as a result of him. And he said that it was caused by someone who was possibly a family member of a child or children at the school she worked at. I couldn't find any evidence to suggest why he said this, apart from him citing the incident where her pillowcase was cut as a mob tactic. There were a couple strange occurrences that possibly could be traced back to Roy, such as someone with an accent who called to ask about how many floors the hospital had and if there was security on the emergency unit, and similar things that struck the person working at the hospital as very odd. So this was while Cindy was in the hospital recovering from one of the attacks, and the person who worked at the hospital initially thought that the caller had a New Zealand accent, but when she heard the South African accent that Roy had, she stated that that was the accent she had heard. So she confirmed that it was South African and it sounded a lot like Roy. Why would he be calling to ask about the floors the hospital had and security and things like that? Was he planning something else? Cindy hired a private investigator at one point, which seems odd if she was doing this all to herself. Why would she hire someone who could reveal her and call her out and spend all that money that she was spending on him when she wasn't making all that much? That doesn't make any sense to me. There were several times that Cindy was physically attacked in ways that could have resulted in her death. She had stockings tied so tightly around her neck that the person who found her thought she was dead at first. She had a note pinned to the floor through her hand. That's intense and messed up. Who could do that to themselves? And these were times where it wasn't like she was just going to be found right away sometimes. The private investigator who found Cindy after this attack stated that he did not believe that there was any way she could have inflicted that injury on herself given the angle of the knife, etc. Police were kind of phoning it in at this point, so although there was no evidence of an outside person ever found, after a while they weren't even looking for one. Like, they didn't look so hard. In this incident, they did not even check for fingerprints, like on the knife or the note that was pinned to her hand with the knife. So the private investigator had given Cindy a two-way radio because her phone line kept getting cut. And he said, use this if you are in trouble. So during this attack, she did contact him. He ran over, and that was how he found her, with a note through her hand. And of course, the black stocking around her neck, and passed out, I think maybe injected with drugs as well. In another incident, Cindy was found outside, confused and suffering hypothermia after an attack. These were very serious injuries. She even ended up in a coma after an attack. Any of these easily could have resulted in her death if she had not been found when she was. Some accounts I found said that Cindy passed polygraph tests about if she inflicted the wounds on herself and if she was behind the notes that were written about her, but the tests showed that she was being evasive and withholding information. I have probably said it before, but I don't put too much stock in polygraph tests. It's also interesting to note that Roy was also asked to take a polygraph test, but he was not able to because there was like some medical reason that it was not effective on him. It's also interesting to note that apparently during the few months when Roy was being actively investigated by the police, Cindy's stalker went quiet. There was no phone calls, notes, or assaults during this time. At one point, Cindy's house was set on fire, and many of her belongings were damaged or destroyed. Her friends Agnes and Tom were staying with her at the time, and when Tom ran out to find a neighbor, he saw a man just standing there outside of the house. Tom asked the man to call 911, but the man had turned and took off running down the street without saying a word. That is kind of weird and sketchy, but not definitive proof of anything. I mean, that could have just been a random person who went by and was like, whoa. In one kidnapping incident, Cindy was taken from a public park in a green van and injected with something. She was found hours later near death. Under hypnosis, she mentioned that she had heard the voice of her ex-husband Roy in the van, and that he had used a South African term, which she recited, I think, somewhat incorrectly, but it was similar to a South African term. After being released from the psychiatric hospital, Cindy went to the police and told them that she believed her ex-husband Roy Makepeace was responsible. Cindy kept diaries, and these repeatedly mentioned the person who was stalking her. If she was making it up, she definitely went through a lot of effort to maintain it by writing in her diary blaming someone else. She also frequently expressed frustration with the police and their response, and how they did not take her seriously or accused her of perpetrating the assaults on herself. Like, unless she didn't know she was doing this to herself, which is possible, she really faked it because she was I'm sure she didn't think anyone was going to go read her diaries. So why would she take the time to put all that effort into writing diaries about someone stalking and harassing her if nobody actually was? A private investigator, Ozzy Caban, reported being suspicious of the police officer whom he said was obsessed and infatuated with Cindy, Pat McBride, who we talked about a little bit earlier. Ozzy found his behavior really creepy and off-putting, but he was investigated as a suspect at one point and was eventually ruled out by all parties. Once Pat was ruled out, Ozzy felt the only real suspect left was Cindy's ex-husband, Roy. A co-worker of Cindy said that she saw Roy with another woman shortly before they split, and several times said that Cindy came in bruised on her face or around her eyes before Cindy and Roy separated, and that Cindy had claimed that Roy had done it. When Cindy's body was found, it was in an area that had heavy pedestrian traffic, so it's unlikely she would not have been seen or smelled by people in the area. Let's be honest, dead bodies have a strong smell to them, and like any dead animal or person will have a very strong smell, and 2 weeks is plenty of time for that smell to occur. She was found fully clothed, lying on her side with her hands and feet tied behind her back. She was also covered in wounds and bruises and had been injected or ingested a high dose of morphine and flurazepam, which is a drug similar to Valium. There was no needle found at the scene. However, Cindy was found with a needle mark on her arm. The death ultimately was not ruled as an accident, suicide, or murder, but was listed as an unknown event. The abandoned house was also frequently inhabited by squatters, and some teenagers had 2 small parties in that week before her body was discovered, so it's difficult to believe that they would not have discovered her body if it was there at the time. The hospital that Cindy worked at was very strict with morphine, and Cindy would not have had access to this drug through her work. It is unknown how she would have been able to obtain it at all if, in fact, she was the one that got it and injected it herself or ingested it. Cindy's parents, sister, private investigator, and her ex-husband all believed Cindy was actually being stalked and harassed by someone else. Roy Makepeace denied having any involvement, but insisted that Cindy was not making it up and that there were others after her. So there is a lot more. Like, in one incident, she was found with like a man's boot on or something and nothing else, or she was found with like weird articles of clothing. There's a lot more that I just don't have the time to get into. Like I said, there was a 12-part Audible podcast on this case, so there's so much that I just couldn't get to. But my thoughts on the case. So in researching this case, I went so back and forth constantly. There was a lot of compelling evidence both ways, and that's kind of where I ended up landing. It's, you know, that quote, just because they're paranoid doesn't mean they're not after you. That's kind of what I believe happened. I just cannot fathom that she would have been capable of repeatedly drugging and assaulting herself to the point of near death and ultimately death. I also don't know that she would have killed cats that were found strung up in her yard. 3 cats on different incidents, I think. I don't think she would have hurt her absolutely beloved dog that was everything to her, very important and treasured, or destroyed her garden, which she took so much pleasure in and spent so much time working on. Stabbing herself in the hand seems too brutal, as well as almost dying of hypothermia and all the wounds and injuries she endured throughout the course of 7 years. Especially her death, the facts just don't add up to her being able to perpetrate this on herself. She at the very least would have had someone helping her or moving the body there after she died. And I think that her body was found 1.5 miles from her car, and they didn't find any needles or any evidence of what was used to kill her, the drug overdose. So, you know, where did she dispose of it in that time? And if it was in that field where she ingested it or injected it, would she have had the time to then hogtie herself and get rid of it somehow where they never found it? It just doesn't make sense. Also, I'm sorry if you hear birds in the background. My pets decide when they're going to be noisy. It is also clear that Cindy was suffering from mental health issues at the time. Over the course of the 7 years, progressively worse. The diaries she left show someone who was intensely struggling at times, and the anger and hatred that she felt for her ex-husband. So she was really writing bitterly and angrily about him often. Maybe she became frustrated when the police weren't doing anything, and could she have fabricated some of the incidents to get the police more involved? They weren't able to find any answers after the first few times. Maybe she wanted to keep attention on the case until she felt like they were doing anything. Maybe she just felt scared and wanted to bring more people around and more attention. Ultimately, I'm not sure we will ever know. If this was homicide, the main suspect, Roy, who Cindy herself named as the perpetrator, died in 2013, so we might never be able to get any answers. Ultimately, I think it's less important who did it, and more important that this woman had to endure over those almost 7 years unimaginable torment. Whether self-inflicted or not, she did not receive the help that she needed in the form of protection from herself or from others. I also think that this, if it happened in modern day, like right now, we would have had cameras everywhere, and we probably would have a lot more answers than we have right now. Like I said, people are all over the place on this case, and they can get really passionate in believing one thing or another. An inquiry determined that her death was the cause of an unknown event, so it was not ruled accident, suicide, or homicide. I really want to know what you think. Do you think Cindy James faked 7 years of torment and ultimately took her own life, or do you think she was being stalked and toyed with by someone who eventually killed her? Or, like me, do you think it's a combination of both? Well, I'd love to hear from you. I really am curious what people think. Like I said, everyone's been so divided, so I wanted to break down. This says yes, this says no, and there's a lot of compelling stuff both ways. So, yeah, please let me know. And if you want to find out more information, it is out there. There's a lot I just couldn't get to. So, like I said, look into it more and let me know.